they need to be held accountable.
Good afternoon, everybody. Judy Maggio with KLRU. Welcome to our, I guess this is our final Capital Coffee Talk of the season.
It's the season ender.
It's the season ender.
It's going to end on a cliffhanger.
Just like Game of Thrones.
I don't watch Game of Thrones, but I certainly hope it ends better than that one, based on what I've seen on social media.
I should like the ending.
Oh, okay.
Ben Philpott here with KUT, and the sine die has occurred.
Yeah.
This 86th session is in the history books.
They have adjourned without a day.
Yeah, and no special session, right?
And no special session. The governor tweeted that yesterday evening. No special session, which I wasn't really surprised by, just because in the 2017 session, I feel like the last month of the session was Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and the Speaker Strauss saying, if you don't pass this, we're going to call for a special. If you don't, especially Dan Patrick. I mean, he had multiple press conferences saying if the House did not pass 5 or 6 bills, that he would ask for a special session by the governor. The governor would say, yes, I think that's a good idea. And then, of course, we had a special session with 20 different items on it.
Oh, I remember. Well, 2017 was a kind of a polarizing session with the bathroom bill and the sanctuary city. This seemed to be a more respectful, kind of a kinder, gentler, if you will.
I mean, there were still issues that could have been more polarizing on the agenda, but maybe a little bit of Dennis Bonnen, the new Speaker of the Texas House, maybe a little bit of Republicans in general wanting to focus more on things like school finance and property taxes than some of the other stuff, just led to, I don't know.
More harmony.
Yeah, at least getting more stuff done.
Yeah. Nobody dug in their heels as much as they did in 2017 and said, no way. And
I don't think so. And you also just had, the people that were, the groups that tended to force kind of the more divisive stuff just didn't seem to have the kind of teeth that they have in previous sessions, either outside groups and also inside groups like the Freedom Caucus in the Texas House, which, opposed pretty much everything that Joe Strauss, the former speaker, did. Freedom Caucus made the regular noise that they do, but they actually ended up losing members this time around. People, including Jonathan Stickland, who was one of the biggest gadflies out of the Freedom Caucus, ended up quitting the Freedom Caucus. So I don't know. I just feel like maybe Speaker Bonnen didn't have as much to deal with on that front and got more things done.
So let's talk about what did get done. What were the big accomplishments of this session? I know that they set out these priorities, and that was property tax cuts and school finance reform.
Yeah, and they did it. I mean, you can argue about whether or not the property tax cuts are substantial and sustainable, but they passed. I mean, they passed $5 billion in school property tax cuts, which, for a $200,000 home might be around a $200 cut. They did also pass property tax caps, soft caps, in that law that voters can either affirm or reject property tax revenue increases by either cities, counties, or school districts. They got those done. They said those were priority bills. They got them both done. So. Or on the property tax side. So, and then they got the school finance bill through,
in the budget,
$4.5 billion for money into classrooms and programs, including things like full day pre-K for low-income Texans, and focus on reading courses so that more students, all students, they hope, are reading on a 3rd grade level by 3rd grade, and then $2 billion on top of that for teacher pay. Part of it is an incentive program. Part of it is money that helps out with teachers' retirement and
their teacher pension
and health insurance, stuff like that.
Yeah. So those are the big winners. Who do you think? Who were the big losers, and what bills were the big losers? When going into the session did you think, oh, that's probably going to pass, but really didn't?
I don't know about individuals who were big losers, but I think the biggest surprise that I had, and maybe others aren't as surprised by it, but was that there was a omnibus elections bill out of the Senate that focused on, according to the bill's author, a lot of election security provisions. this was a bill that Democrats did not like. This was a bill that the county elections administrators did not like, came to the Capitol and lobbied against. There was even a bill that on the Senate side, if I'm remembering the testimony correctly, there were some Republicans that came in and said this is not a good bill, it goes too far, or it doesn't do this enough, or whatever. Although they made some changes in the House version, I think the organization that was opposed to it just kind of said, it's okay. But it passed out of the House, out of the Senate pretty easily with the Republican majority there. Made it over to the House, had a very long hearing, but easily got out of the House committee, and then was just never put on the calendar for floor debate.
But do you think that there was already a dark cloud over this topic in general because of the non-citizen voter controversy at the start of the session?
I think that Democrats probably used that a lot, but I don't know. I don't know how the two were connected other than there was clearly concern about what had happened with now former Secretary of State David Whitley and that voter roll. Yeah. And then what was being proposed in this bill. There were a lot of concerns from the elections officials that this bill would criminalize accidents that poll workers did, and that was one of their big concerns. And then other groups said, this could frighten away voters because it would criminalize mistakes that voters make. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That was a bill that I was surprised at.
And the final question I wanted to ask you was about David Whitley. So, in the final day of the session, he resigned. Mm-hmm. And this is the appointed Secretary of State, and who was at the forefront of this non-citizen voter controversy at the beginning of the session.
Democrats were able to, hold together. You have to have 2/3 of the senators present to get a nominee through in the Senate, and the Democrats have enough seats in the Senate where if they all stood together, which they did.
And they gained 2 in the Senate
They gained 2 in the Senate.
And 12 in the House, right? Is that right?
Wait a minute, did they gain 2 or did they flip 2 and then they lost 1 because of San Antonio?
We have some...
They did gain 2.
We have some nationally known political experts who are going to be joining us in just a moment, who are giving us pointers from the cheap seats.
I couldn't remember how that San Antonio seat played into it, but for the special election there. But anyway, so they gained 2 seats. So they had more than 2/3.
Okay.
And if they all hung together, then they could stop his name from coming up, and they did. Okay. And then he quit just before it was going to become constitutionally illegal for him to be the Secretary of State. So, but now, and this is something that some voting groups have come out and said recently, it's like, okay, so now the governor has the ability to appoint a new Secretary of State who will not come up for nomination until the 2021 legislative session. So voting groups did not like what Whitley did. Whoever replaces Whitley will have 18 plus months to
be on the job before.
To be on the job, including through the 2020 election, presidential election.
Wow,
and
that's an
congressional
important
elections.
job.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And so there are some, and we don't even know who's being appointed yet. At least I haven't seen anything. So there may be a extremely non-controversial pick. I don't feel like the previous 2 or 3 picks from Governor Abbott have been considered controversial, like Whitley was. So we'll just have to see what happens.
So Ben, final question. I would call the 2017 session polarizing. How would you, in a word, describe the 2019 session? Or you can use a couple of words.
Promises kept, I guess you could say, in terms of what, and I don't necessarily mean campaign promises, but heading into the session, the promise was something on school finance, something on property taxes, and that
the big 3 made that promise at the top in that kumbaya moment, and here we are at the end,
and they got it done. Now you can argue maybe there is more work to be done, maybe the property tax bill didn't go far enough, maybe the school finance bill didn't go far enough, but
something
but they got
was
major
accomplished.
They got major legislation through. Yeah, that's right.
And that's their job.
And
they accomplished it this time. Ben Philpott, as always, thank you for your expertise and perspective on the legislative session. I know that this is something you've been covering for a long time, and it's always nice to hear your thoughts and views.
Well, thank you. I'm just glad it's over. You can't see at home, but I'm wearing shorts.
He's already wearing shorts
ready,
to celebrate.
I'm ready to go.
But we're going to have more in-depth analysis from 3 political experts who are known nationally in just a minute. But first, we're going to let Ben go back to his job at the KUT newsroom. He's always very busy over there. But first, I want to tell everybody that in May, our big focus on Decibel has been transportation, the topic that Austin loves to hate, traffic and transportation. So we're going to be taking a good look at that from many different angles. And we want to give you a sneak preview and also let you know that at 2:30 today, we're going to be talking about women's safety on public transportation, things to keep in mind if you are a female, or really anyone, when you take public transportation, some safety issues you need to keep in mind. But first, here's a preview of our May episode that's called Austin at Transit, and it runs Friday night at 7:30. Take a look.
As we get into the 2 million, 4 million people over the next 20 years, we just can't continue to be dependent as we have been on the automobile.
You're looking at Austin's Achilles heel. We are now the most congested city in Texas, but we didn't arrive here overnight.
There was a time period there where roads, highways in particular, were unpopular politically. And the city, to some degree, fell behind on the highways part of it and then was growing at such a great rate throughout the 80s, the 90s, and ever since, that things just sort of got ahead of themselves.
Austin is playing catch-up. Since Cap Metro came aboard in 1985, local voters have rejected expanding light rail twice. Traditional transportation has proven much more popular. The multi-million-dollar mobility plans passed in the last few years are slated for road and corridor improvements. But with 150 newcomers arriving in Austin every day, it will take more than better roads to keep traffic flowing. You can expect another major mobility bond next year, this one to pay for a high-capacity transit system to try to move Austin into the future.
So what we're trying to think through is how is public transit going to shape that new world and fit in with all these new mobility options so people can live their lives, do what they want to do, and really have a good quality of life that Austin's known for and gives people more freedom to do what they want to do.
The 86th session of the Texas Legislature is over. We just talked to Ben Philpott and kind of got a political reporter's perspective on what was accomplished and what wasn't. And we have invited 3 really nationally known political experts who share different political viewpoints as well to come in and talk about where we are as a state, what was accomplished, what wasn't accomplished, and kind of what it all means to you and me. So I'm going to start with Matt Mackowiak. He is the Texas Travis County Republican Party chair. Also run a consulting group called Potomac
Strategy Group, yep.
Potomac Strategy Group.
Yep.
Then we have Dr. Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. She is the Director of Community Engagement at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and you've probably seen her on MSNBC and other nationally known programs. And on the far left, we have Ed Espinoza, who is with Progress Texas. And so Ed and Matt have a little bit different political viewpoints and probably perspectives on what happened during the legislature. And we have Vicki here in the middle to kind of
I'll moderate
be the academic moderator.
Referee.
I'll keep them from getting too rough here.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, let's talk about this session in general. What do you think was accomplished, and what surprised you about it? You want to start, Matt?
Well, look, I think as you and Ben were discussing earlier, I mean, this session was defined by the necessity of acting on property tax reform and school finance. They made an effort in the last legislative session to try to do both, and really the Senate wanted to do property tax and the House wanted to do school finance, and neither would really give in. And I think the realization that's occurred in the last year or so is that you really have to do them together. You can provide property tax reform if you address school finance, if you address recapture. And obviously the challenges related to school finance in the public education system and property tax, really skyrocketing property taxes, have been getting worse. So I think if you step back, this session will be remembered, I think, for the fact that you had a new speaker that worked very well with the lieutenant governor and the governor, kept the train on the tracks, and they got the big issues dealt with. You didn't have a lot of really divisive issues. They were mostly bipartisan bills. They're not having a special session. Part of the reason they were able to have success is two things. One, they had $9 billion in extra money to spend because of the strength of the economy. Second, they decided to basically obligate future legislatures as it relates to property tax. There appears to basically be money for the next 2 bienniums, but when you get to 2024 on the current trajectory, there's really probably not money to guarantee the property tax level commitment that they've made. So I think there are grassroots Republicans and conservatives that are frustrated with the legislative session. We didn't see the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying end. We didn't see preemption of paid sick leave, which is affecting Austin and San Antonio small businesses. I go through a laundry list of conservative priorities that were in the Republican Party Texas platform that we thought would have a good chance of passing. So I think there is some angst out there among conservatives, out among the grassroots. But on the 2 big issues, they did it in a bipartisan way, and they accomplished what they had to accomplish, which is why we're not going to have a special session.
Well, I do want to circle back and talk about some of the more right-leaning issues in the Republican Party that didn't see the light of day this time around. But I'm going to go to you next, Ed, because you come at this from a more progressive angle. Tell us what you thought of the session.
Yeah, well, it definitely was a more even-keeled session, especially compared to the fire and brimstone of 2017. But I think that 2019 was a bit more bipartisan, and I think it had to do a lot with the fact that Democrats elected 12 members to the legislature and 2 more members to the Senate. And when those numbers started to narrow, the gap between the parties, there was then a necessity for bipartisanship. You couldn't just railroad things through like they used to be able to in the past. Now, this time we got school finance passed. Didn't get as much as we want. We got something. We made some progress. But remember, when the Republicans were at the height of their majority in 2011, they cut $5 billion from public education. So you're seeing a complete 180 on that, and I think it's because the legislature itself looks a lot different than it did 8 years ago. Now,
Go ahead.
There's some other things. Paid sick, we're glad to see that is still intact. There was also a concerted effort to change a lot of voting laws in this state, and that didn't go anywhere. You had some laws that would have been really dangerous. If somebody gives people rides to the polls, they might have to sign a sworn affidavit, or if somebody leaves a blank box on their voter registration form, some registrars might have had the ability to throw that registration out, in addition to all the other voting issues that were on the table with the voter purge and such. So I think in the end it ended up being a better session for progressives, really I think a better session for Texas, and it has to do entirely with the makeup of the legislative body.
So I want to turn to you now, Vicki, because I'm wondering, do you think that these more middle-of-the-road issues passed because the big 3 said, we're kumbaya, we're going to do this together? Or do you think it was because there were more Democrats voting on these issues, or a little of both?
So earlier we were talking about, what was a legislative session in 1 word or a couple of words? So for me, it's 3 words. It's elections have consequences. And in the 2018 election, when all 4 of us were together debriefing, we're like, wow, we have a dozen new Democrats in the House, 2 new in the Senate. So this is going to change the makeup, change the priorities. So I think this is really why we saw it. Yes, there was the kumbaya moment. And yes, Dan Bonin has a solid leadership style. But ultimately, it's that electoral connection. And if I could maybe zoom out a little bit and talk about what this means for Texas nationally. So we saw all of these policies come forward. They're going to affect us day to day here in Texas. But what does this mean for the 2020? What does this mean for our presidential race that is starting to heat up? It means that Texas is not that deep red it was during the Tea Party revolution of 2010 that we saw into 2013 and on. So I'm seeing a little bit of shift. I'm not saying that Texas is purple. I'm not saying that we're veering left, but I think that we are seeing from the election results and the policies that were passed and stopped in this past Texas legislative session, that we're seeing a little bit of a lightening of the red in Texas, both locally and nationally.
So what were some of the far-right issues, Matt, that or just issues for the Republican Party that you were disappointed that didn't make it past the starting gate, or maybe a little bit down the track but then got stopped?
Yeah, and I would say a lot of these priorities did pass the Senate. They just didn't pass in the House, and I think part of it was the election. I think part of it was the Speaker and his leadership team really decided that they couldn't have divisive issues if they were going to, in a bipartisan way, address these really two very complicated issues. We had to step back. The fact that they hadn't done school finance reform, I don't even remember the last time, 15 years probably, or 10 years at least.
Oh, it's
Property
15.
tax has been like 30 or 40 years. So the fact they did both in the same session in 140 days, is impressive. Look, the list is actually pretty long. I think it's 6 or 8 or 10 things. As I mentioned, I think conservatives would have liked to have seen paid sick leave preempted. It's affecting small business owners. It's affecting the fast food industry. Many private businesses offer paid sick leave. Some don't, and that is a benefit that workers can earn depending on where they're working. And of course, everyone wants to be able to have paid sick time off. The question is whether government should make that a mandate, and what is the cost to the economy of doing that. So that was a disappointment. I don't even understand why that didn't move forward. If that got a vote in both bodies, it would pass. I'm pretty confident. The ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying by cities and counties passed the Senate. They watered it down the House, and then 25 Republicans voted against it, even though rural areas were exempted. The budget ended up growing 12%. That's well beyond population plus inflation. That would have been around 8%. So it was a pretty significant increase in the budget. You didn't see significant pro-life legislation move forward.
As you did in many other states.
As you have in many other states. I know Ed and I disagree on how, quote, pro-life Texas is. I do believe Texas is strongly pro-life. They did pass an anti-infanticide bill, basically a Born Alive Protection Act, which did pass, but they didn't take up heartbeat legislation and other legislation. I could literally keep going for quite a while here of other parties that didn't move forward. I do think there's a disconnect between sort of House leaders and some of the state leaders who really feel like since they addressed the two top issues, it was a huge session and a big success and everyone's going to be patting them on the back. I think they're going to find when they go out, talk to our local Republicans in their districts, when they go to their precinct convention, Senate district convention, state convention next year, there's some frustration out there that really so many of these priorities didn't advance at a time when we have, again, Republican majority in the House, Republican majority in the Senate, and every statewide elected official is Republican.
So would you two agree with that? The idea that the people in the rural areas, the Republicans in general probably aren't that happy with some of the results?
I guess when you're used to getting everything you want in the past few sessions, that the idea of maybe not getting everything it might become as a shock. But I do think that there are some people disappointed for a number of reasons. Yes, Republicans might be, some grassroots, far-right Republicans, activist Republicans, may be more upset. By the way, the paid sick bill didn't get through because so many things were tacked onto it that it became unpalatable for many people to vote for. It would have been an election liability for them. But other issues that I think that people are concerned about is this constant attack on local control that we see here in Texas, whether it's the paid sick bill or whether it's property tax limitations or even whether or not a city can contract with a clinic. Those types of things.
The Planned Parenthood bill.
The Planned Parenthood clinic here in Austin, especially in the fact when you have a state that is the most uninsured state in America, and we didn't see anything to bridge that gap in the legislature, and the one local control bill that actually does attempt to bridge that gap seeks to actually tear down that bridge in a sense. So, look, it was a better session than in 2017. We did some good things, but we still have some progress to make, and I think there's plenty to celebrate. There's also plenty of frustration to go around on both sides.
On both sides.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, Vicki?
I do, in terms of the activists, the grassroots activists. I can see where there's frustration on the Republican side, but the top leaders in their heart of hearts know that voters voted a certain way, and if they want to keep what they have and maybe even recuperate some seats, they can't go too far to the extreme. You know, the suburban women spoke. They saw the increase in Latino turnout that we were talking about a couple of months ago. So even though they may be frustrated that their more social and morally conservative bills didn't go through, they know that they couldn't make too much noise. They couldn't push the governor to get into a special session for a heartbeat bill because, you know, sometimes you've got to give a little so you can get more, which is namely more seats or stop bleeding seats in 2020.
What does this mean to the average Texan? I mean, you know, we like to sit around and talk politics because we love this stuff. But, you know, the average person who may be tuning in goes, okay, so what does this mean to me, this whole school finance reform and property tax? I mean, from each of your perspectives, what do you think they need to know?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the top line numbers are important to understand. I think they put about $4 billion in new money into public education. I forget if I said this earlier. They cut recapture in half, which matters to a huge extent here in Austin. The Austin School District is the single most penalized.
Hemorrhaging money.
Yeah,
yes.
I think more than half of their education dollars get sent to the state for recapture. So you can imagine that getting cut. Significantly, that's going to be able to enable some property tax reform. Look, I think the reality is for the last 5 or 10 years, the average person has seen annual increases in property taxes due to valuations of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12%.
Here in Central Texas,
Here
for
in Central
sure,
Texas,
we've seen
but
this.
it's honestly been everywhere. Urban, suburban, I mean, even in some rural counties, areas that really shouldn't be dealing with that. And the reason for that is that the rollback rate was quite a bit higher, and so the cities and counties would basically go right up to the limit. So they didn't want to face the voters and ask for more money than they needed because they didn't think the voters would approve it. So they go right up to the line. And so I think for the average person that was dealing with 8, 9, 10% annual increases, it's now going to be much more like 3.5%. That's much more sustainable. That's a population plus inflation type of range. Wage increases can make up for some of that. So people are going to be able to afford to stay in their homes to a greater extent, particularly in 2020 when this takes effect. More so than they would had this continued. The reality is, instead of property taxes going up like this, they're going to go up like this, right? Much smaller level. Now, that's not as great of an argument to make, right? I mean, ideally, Republicans wanted to say we're going to cut your property taxes. And I think the final version of the property tax bill, which almost doubled, it was $2.7 billion in the House when it passed, and the conference bill was over $5 billion. I think it actually is going to produce a very minor, modest property tax cut for the average homeowner.
Depending on how much your value's gone up.
Exactly. $250,000 home, I think you get a $200 tax cut
Yeah.
in 2020 and a $300 tax cut in 2021. Not huge amounts of money, but when you compare that again to the increases, where people were getting basically property taxed out of their homes. So I think in terms of how average people are going to be affected, more money in education, teacher raise of $4,000 pretty on average for teachers and librarians. Significant investment in public education, significant investment to reform the property tax system. I think that's really what's going to affect people day to day.
Vicki, what would you see as the Texas takeaways for an everyday citizen?
I think more civility. I think the fact that we didn't get into sanctuary cities, anti-immigrant rhetoric, that we didn't get into a ugly abortion debate like we did in 2013, for example. We didn't get into the bathroom bill era that we did last legislative session, where both sides were just at each other's throats. So I think that lack of civility can trickle down into the coffee talk, folks and neighbors talking to each other. So I think it helps promote civility, promote civic engagement. I think it promotes respect. And one thing, it's a little off topic, but I do want to get it in there, is in terms of the strategy. I want to mention one thing, and that is redistricting. Because in 2020, this is such an important election, and I think, again, the leaders of the parties knew it, that they have to keep it together, Republicans, and try to gain as many seats as they can, because they know that the big prize and the big ticket is the redistricting that's going to happen after the 2020 election. So I think that is a big thing that was hovering in the background of this session, that they have to keep their eyes on that prize.
Very good point. Takeaways.
So, look, most normal people, right, not us, but like most normal people, they really don't follow the legislature day in and day out. Most people don't even follow Congress day in and day out. They kind of get their updates in the paper about once or twice a week. So ultimately what it comes down to with these things is that the voters want to know if their representatives are on their team. Do they see the things that they see? Do they feel the things that they feel? And the two biggest issues in this state are public education and health care. Public education, they made a little bit of progress on this year. We'll see if people actually feel the changes. There's a difference between making a policy change and actually feeling that change. Was the property tax change enough for people to actually notice it? Are the change in public school funding enough for people to actually notice those changes as well? As far as health care goes, look, it's mostly a national issue, but there's things we can do at the state level, and they didn't get done this time. So I think that those are two issues that we'll have to see how the voters will respond to that. The big issue heading into 2020 is that Trump will be on the ballot. And I think that Speaker Bonin was really careful. Look, the guy has got good political instincts. And when you see that
the honeymoon kind of never went away for him. People said at the beginning session, oh, it's going to be great. And he really kept a lot of his dignity and promises and everything else.
I think to be a good speaker, you have to be a good manager.
Yeah.
And recognizing that Democrats had newfound strength and more importantly, that Democrats are only 9 seats away from flipping the House after they had just picked up 12 and 5 more from the year previously. Those are important indicators. He sees the writing on the wall. He realizes that this needs to be a different type of legislature than it was in years past. And in 2020, regardless of what the legislature did this time, they will be tied to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is not really one to pull punches. I don't know if you knew that or not. He's not really one for subtleties, but anything having to do with immigration, LGBT equality, abortion, healthcare, public education, all those things will be on the table. And whether it's fair or not, many state Republicans are going to be tied to that national narrative. So I think they tried to do everything they could this time to get around it. I think Democrats came out looking very good in this session. We'll see how voters reward each party in heading into 2020.
So I want to end with 2020 and some of your big picture observations about, and you've already talked a little bit about this, Vicki, but let's talk a little bit more about where we are as a state when it comes to Democrats and Republicans, and where we might be in the 2020 election. I know that the statistics show Texas is not really even purple yet, but it looks like there are gains obviously being made by the Democrats. So where do you see all of this big picture wise heading into the 2020 election?
Yeah, I think the biggest question was 2018, the beginning of a trend of the state moving to be much more competitive, or was it sort of a 30-year flood due to really Beto's $80 million and sort of the last gasp of straight ticket voting, which ended in 2018. I tend to be more in the latter category than the former. I do think the state's changing. The demographics are changing. It's affecting voting patterns, and there's no question. I think the Democrats have picked up a lot of the seats that they can pick up. I don't think they're going to necessarily be able to continue to gain ground to the extent they did. Look, if you're a Democrat, you were pretty motivated in 2018, and Trump wasn't on the ballot. You kind of felt like he was. You wanted to send a message. But it's hard for me to see how Democratic enthusiasm is going to increase in 2020 compared to 2018. I do think without Trump on the ballot, there were Trump supporters who didn't turn out in 2018. So I think Republican enthusiasm is going to be higher. But look, it's going to depend a lot on whether this trade stuff gets solved, where the economy is next year, who the Democratic nominee is. There's a lot of variables. There's going to be a lot of action in Texas. I mean, you're going to have 6 to 8 congressional seats that are going to be hotly contested because of redistricting. You're going to have at least one state Senate seat that's going to be very hotly contested. You're going to have 20, 30 state House seats potentially. Not only are Democrats going to try to flip 9 seats, Republicans are going to try to take some of those 12 seats back, right? So that's 21 seats just right there. Yeah. That doesn't include retirements and other types of changes. So plus you have Senator John Cornyn who's up, who's going to be facing some type of challenge.
Yeah, MJ Hagar's already announced.
Exactly. So my point is, I think at the statewide level, Democrats got closer, right? Beto lost by 2.6%. Dan Patrick's margin was less than 5. The Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller's win, I think, was less than 3. So Paxton's win was less than 4. So they narrowed the margin at the statewide level. The question is whether that's, again, the beginning of a trend of the state really becoming more purple, or whether that was really kind of a one-off, really unique and political environment. Again, I think Republicans have to take the election environment very seriously. In the midterm, I mean, this presidential election is going to be extremely important here. Because of redistricting and everything else. But I still think we're a red state. We're just a little bit less red than we were. And the question is 2020 going to look more like 2018, or is it going to look more like 2016?
Mm-hmm. Ed? Big picture 2020.
Well, big picture, we keep talking about the 2018 bump, whether it was an anomaly or a trend. But 2016 is important because 2016 was a market improvement over 2012 and 2014. In 2012, Democrats lost this state by 12%. In 2016, that was reduced to 9%, and then last year it was roughly 3%, just below 3%. So it's trending in the right direction, and these are actually
if you're a Democrat.
Well, if you're a Democrat, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. If you're progressive, you're trending in the right direction. Picked up 5 seats in the legislature in 2016. 12 more seats in 2018. That's a net gain of 17 seats in 2 years, 2 election cycles. So I think that's important. The other thing to keep in mind here is that Texas is the fastest growing state in America. And many of those voters who have never voted before, who are moving here from other places, are showing up to vote, and they did so in 2016 and again in 2018. This is now a pattern of behavior here. We have 2 sleeping giants in Texas. There's the Latino sleeping giant that we talk about all the time, and then there is the new giant of all these new people who are moving here and suddenly starting to vote, and they've been doing that in the past few election cycles. I think 2020 is going to look a lot different than what we're used to seeing in presidential cycles. I believe that a purple state is defined by how close the state is, and I think that we are there right now. And I think the fact that both sides are investing a lot financially into the state in 2020 is going to underscore that as well.
Sum it all up for us.
All right, if I were a betting woman, which I'm not, Trump wins Texas. But I think we're still in the single digits and going down. There's a trend, but it's a slower trend. You know, folks who don't live in Texas say, yep, it's going to go fast. You guys are making all of these interesting changes. Look at these vote margins. Change tends to happen slowly, with few exceptions. So I think there's that. And the other change that I foresee is Republicans dialing it back maybe a little bit more to the George W. Bush era. So what we saw was the pendulum swing in 2010 to a very Tea Party conservative Ted Cruz type of brand. But in the 90s, Texas was the poster child of moderation. You know, you had Pete Wilson in California being a very staunch right-leaning conservative, and George W. Bush was saying, hey, this is compassionate conservatism. We can find a middle ground. So I think not only are Democrats gaining some ground, but I think that the mindset of Republicans, if they want to stay in the mix, is going to be to moderate, maybe a la Dennis Bonnen of this past session.
Great perspective, you guys. Ed Espinoza, Victoria DeFrancesco, Soto, and Matt Mackowiak. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts now that the session's over, and we're looking forward to the 2020 election and how this all plays out. So hopefully you can come back and do this again for us.
That'd be great.
We have an early primary.
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Yes, we do. Don't forget to vote. Thanks so much for spending a little bit of your afternoon with us on Capital Coffee Talk. Go out and make it a great day.